When 27-year-old Francesca disappeared during her solo motorcycle trip across America, investigators were certain she'd crashed somewhere in Colorado's treacherous mountain passes. Her family spent years searching those peaks and valleys, clinging to hope that faded with each passing season. 6 years later, what crews pulled from the Rio Grande made everyone realize they'd been looking in the wrong place all along, and pushed the investigation down a disturbing new path. The silence began as a minor anomaly, a small, easily dismissed break in a carefully established pattern. For the Sullivan family living in suburban Pennsylvania, the rhythm of late August 2018 had been set by the daily check-ins from their daughter Francesca. At 27, she was on the adventure of a lifetime, a solo motorcycle trip across the United States, a journey she had meticulously planned for over a year. The rule was simple, a non-negotiable promise made to her anxious parents before she'd wheeled her loaded-down motorcycle out of their driveway: one call or text every single evening, no matter what. On the first day, August 23rd, the absence of her call was explained away with logic. Her mother, Eleanor, reminded her husband, Mark, that Francesca was riding through the heart of the Colorado Rockies. Cell service was notoriously spotty in those vast, rugged landscapes. She had likely found a campsite deep in a valley far from any tower and would call first thing in the morning. Mark agreed, though a flicker of unease had already begun. Francesca was a planner. She knew her route and would have anticipated dead zones. The second day, the unease grew into a persistent, gnawing anxiety. Calls to Francesca's phone went straight to voicemail, the canned, impersonal greeting a stark contrast to her usually vibrant voice. Texts sent from their phones remained stubbornly marked as undelivered, trapped in digital limbo. Eleanor found herself compulsively checking Francesca's social media pages, hitting refresh on a feed that remained frozen in time. Its last update was a cheerful post from 3 days prior. The family's conversations became clipped, the air in their home thick with unspoken fears. The rationalizations started to sound hollow. By the morning of the third day, August 25th, the silence was no longer an anomaly. It was a deafening alarm. This was profoundly unlike Francesca. She was an experienced rider, having spent years exploring the back roads of the East Coast. She was competent, cautious, and deeply aware of her family's worry. She wouldn't intentionally cause them this kind of distress. The trip was a celebration of her independence, but she had never confused independence with recklessness. The family's last point of contact was a single radiant image sent to her mother's phone. It was a selfie taken from a low angle, capturing Francesca's face in a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. Her wide, genuine smile seemed to fill the frame, her eyes crinkling against the bright mountain sun. Her sunglasses were pushed up on her head, holding back strands of brown hair whipped loose by the wind. She wore her favorite blue and black armored motorcycle jacket. Behind her stood her pride and joy, a red BMW sport touring bike. Its rear seat was piled high with black waterproof bags containing everything she needed to live on the road for 2 months. The backdrop was breathtaking, almost unreal, a panorama of jagged, snow-dusted peaks rising above a high-altitude lake whose water was a shocking shade of turquoise. The accompanying text was short and effusive. It read, "Made it to the top of the world. Unbelievable. Love you." At the time, the message was a gift, a perfect distillation of her adventurous spirit. Now, it felt like a ghost. It was her last known footprint, a digital pin dropped on a vast and indifferent map. At the 72-hour mark, the Sullivan family made a decision. Hope had curdled into dread. Mark Sullivan picked up the phone and dialed the Hinsdale County Sheriff's Office in Lake City, Colorado. They had used the distinctive peaks in the photo to narrow down Francesca's last known location to the remote and beautiful San Juan Mountains. In a strained, steady voice, he explained the situation to the dispatcher. He detailed his daughter's broken communication pattern, her unwavering reliability, and the growing certainty that something was wrong. He provided her full name, Francesca Sullivan, her date of birth, and a detailed description of her and her motorcycle. He emailed the final joyful selfie and the text message that now seemed so ominous. The official report was filed. A case number was assigned. Across the country, in a quiet sheriff's office, Surrounded by the very mountains that had so thrilled her, Francesca Sullivan was now officially a missing person. The official investigation into the disappearance of Francesca Sullivan began in the small, wood-paneled office of Detective David Miller of the Hinsdale County Sheriff's Office. Miller was a man in his late 50s, with a face weathered by decades of high-altitude sun and a calm demeanor that belied a sharp, methodical mind. He had handled dozens of missing persons cases over his career, most of them hikers or hunters who had underestimated the raw power of the San Juan Mountains. These cases almost always ended in one of two ways: a dramatic rescue or a grim recovery. He hoped for the former, but prepared for the latter. His first step was to build a timeline, a concrete map of Francesca's last known movements. The Sullivan family had already provided the emotional anchor, the final photo. But Miller needed data. He spent the first 48 hours securing warrants and sending formal requests to Francesca's cell phone provider and bank. The digital breadcrumbs, he knew, would be impartial and precise. The bank records were the first to arrive. They showed a clear pattern of gas station stops and small grocery purchases, tracing a logical path westward. The final transaction was a $15.72 purchase at a gas station on the edge of Lake City, Colorado, made at 11:42 a.m. on August 22nd. This was their starting point. The cell phone data was more complex. It confirmed the last successful communication was the photo message sent from Francesca's phone on the afternoon of the 22nd. After that, the records showed a series of failed attempts by her family to reach her. The crucial piece of information was the last passive signal, or ping, from her device. It came in the early evening of August 22nd, a brief automated connection to a cell tower located at the top of Slumgullion Pass. Miller pulled up a topographical map and drew a wide cone radiating from the tower's location. The signal's reach covered a staggering 300 square miles of some of the most rugged and inaccessible terrain in the continental United States. The ping confirmed Francesca was somewhere within that vast wedge of wilderness, but it did little to narrow the search. She could be anywhere along the Alpine Loop Scenic Byway, a network of treacherous jeep roads, or down any one of 100 unmarked Forest Service roads. She could be at the bottom of a canyon, hidden by dense pine and aspen, completely invisible from the air. The initial theory was the most probable one: a tragic accident. Francesca, an East Coast rider, might have been caught off guard by the sharp, unpaved switchbacks or a patch of loose gravel on a steep mountain pass. A single moment of misjudgment could have sent her and her motorcycle tumbling over an embankment, far from the view of passing motorists. With this scenario in mind, the official search began in earnest. The Hinsdale County Sheriff's Office coordinated with the Civil Air Patrol. For 3 consecutive days, their single-engine Cessna aircraft flew slow, deliberate grid patterns over the search area. From 1,000 feet up, pilots and spotters scanned the landscape, their eyes straining to catch a glint of chrome or a flash of red against the sprawling green and brown canvas of the mountains. The sheer scale of the task was daunting. The terrain was a chaotic jumble of peaks, valleys, dense forests, and rocky scree fields. A motorcycle, even a bright red one, could be swallowed by the landscape with terrifying ease. Simultaneously, ground teams were mobilized. Deputies in 4x4 trucks drove the main arteries of the search area, including the entirety of the Alpine Loop. They drove slowly, stopping at every scenic overlook and pull-off, using binoculars to scan the steep drop-offs below. They looked for broken guardrails, skid marks in the dirt, or snapped branches, any sign that a vehicle had left the road. They found nothing. The mountains kept their secrets. The search was physically and emotionally draining. Each day ended with the same result: no sign of Francesca, no sign of her motorcycle. The vastness of the wilderness felt less like a beautiful backdrop and more like an adversary. After 4 days of fruitless searching, Detective Miller shifted his focus from the landscape to the people who inhabited it. He began a systematic canvass of every business along Francesca's likely route: gas stations, diners, and the handful of motels and lodges scattered throughout the remote county. He carried a stack of freshly printed flyers featuring the smiling selfie and a clear photo of her red BMW. In a small, rustic motel just outside Lake City, he got his first break. The owner, a man named George, recognized Francesca immediately. He remembered her bright energy and infectious enthusiasm. She had stayed one night, he recalled, and had spent half an hour in the lobby telling him about her journey. As Miller was about to leave, George hesitated, then added something else. He said Francesca had mentioned a strange encounter at the gas station in town earlier that day. She had recounted it with a laugh, brushing it off as more weird than threatening, but it had clearly stuck in her mind. A man had approached her while she was fueling her bike. He wasn't just casually admiring it. He was unusually persistent, asking a string of pointed questions. He wanted to know her destination, whether she was traveling alone, and made several comments about how valuable a bike like hers was. George said Francesca had described him as making her feel a little prickly, a feeling she wasn't used to on her trip. This was the first tangible lead, the first thread that pointed away from a simple accident and toward a possible human element. Miller thanked George and immediately drove to the gas station. The manager on duty was cooperative, and together they reviewed the security camera footage from the afternoon of August 22nd. The camera angle was wide, the image quality grainy, but the scene was unmistakable. There was Francesca in her blue jacket, standing by her red bike. A tall, lanky man in a dirty baseball cap and work boots approached her. The video had no audio, but their body language told a story. Francesca was polite but visibly reserved, keeping a slight distance. The man, however, was animated, gesturing toward the bike, leaning in closer than was comfortable. After a few minutes, he finally walked away, and Francesca quickly finished fueling, got on her bike, and left. Miller showed a still from the video to a local deputy who recognized the man instantly. He was a transient worker, a man who drifted through the mountain towns, picking up odd jobs in construction or ranching during the summer months and disappearing when the cold set in. He had a name, and a minor record for petty theft from years ago. A BOLO, be on the lookout, alert was immediately issued to law enforcement agencies across Colorado and neighboring states, complete with the CCTV image and the man's description. For a week, the investigation had a new urgent focus. The theory shifted. Perhaps the man had followed Francesca from the gas station, waiting for an opportunity. The lead that had generated so much hope dissolved just as quickly. 2 weeks later, a sheriff's deputy in rural Wyoming located the man working on a remote cattle ranch. He was brought in for questioning. He was cooperative and seemed genuinely shocked to learn that the friendly woman with the nice motorcycle was missing. He admitted to the conversation, explaining that he was a huge motorcycle fan and had never seen a BMW sport tourer like hers up close. He said he was just geeking out over the bike. Most importantly, he had a rock-solid, verifiable alibi for the entire week of Francesca's disappearance. His new employer confirmed he had started work the day after he was seen on the CCTV footage, and his time cards, signed by his foreman, showed he had worked 10-hour days without a single absence. He was over 300 miles away when Francesca vanished. After checking his story, investigators had no choice but to clear him. The promising lead evaporated into thin air, leaving the investigation right back where it started. As September bled into October, the character of the San Juan Mountains began to change. The vibrant gold of the aspen leaves faded and fell, carpeting the forest floor. A chill crept into the air, and the peaks that had been merely dusted with snow now wore thick white caps. The first significant snowfall of the season blanketed the high country, burying the landscape under a pristine and impenetrable layer of white. Any remaining physical evidence, skid marks, a discarded item, even the motorcycle itself, was now entombed until spring. Detective Miller convened a meeting with the county sheriff and the head of the local search and rescue team. The conclusion was unavoidable. With winter setting in, a comprehensive ground search was no longer possible. It was a pragmatic, painful decision. The active search for Francesca Sullivan was officially suspended. Miller made the difficult call to the Sullivan family. The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. He assured them the case would remain open, that they would resume in the spring. But everyone understood what this meant. The investigation was going cold. In his office, Miller placed Francesca's file, now thick with maps, reports, and dead-end leads, into the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the mountains, and the mystery, in a deep and silent blanket of white. The spring of 2019 arrived in the San Juan Mountains with a slow, dramatic melt. Snow receded from the high passes, and the rivers swelled with frigid, gray water. For the Sullivan family, the thaw brought not relief but a renewed sense of urgency and profound frustration. The official search, they were told, would not resume with the same intensity. Resources were limited, and without new leads, there was no specific area to focus on. The vast wilderness that had swallowed their daughter remained just as vast, just as impenetrable. Unwilling to let Francesca's memory be relegated to a dusty file in a cabinet, they decided to act. In July, 1 year after Francesca's last message, Mark and Eleanor Sullivan packed their car and drove the 1,800 miles from Pennsylvania to Colorado. It was a pilgrimage born of desperation. They converted a small motel room in Lake City into a makeshift command center. The room filled with stacks of paper, the air thick with the smell of toner from the portable printer they'd brought with them. They spent their days printing thousands of flyers, each one bearing the same smiling photo of their daughter and the stark, bolded word, "Missing." Their search was a grueling, heart-wrenching exercise. They retraced Francesca's route, not on a motorcycle, but in their sensible sedan, a vehicle that felt alien in the rugged landscape. They drove the scenic byways, the same roads Francesca had ridden with such joy, but they saw no beauty. For them, every sharp curve was a potential accident site, every steep drop-off, a possible grave. They stopped in every town, every hamlet, every isolated diner and gas station. They tacked flyers to community bulletin boards, their fresh, crisp papers standing out against faded notices for local bake sales and lost pets. They spoke to anyone who would listen, repeating the story until their voices grew hoarse. The encounters were a painful tapestry of human reaction. Some locals were deeply sympathetic, remembering the case from the news and offering words of comfort. Others were polite but distant, their eyes holding a weary look that said they'd seen many frantic families pass through over the years. A few were dismissive, almost annoyed by the intrusion. For the Sullivans, each interaction was a fresh wound, a reminder that while their world had stopped, the rest of the world had moved on. As the physical search yielded nothing but exhaustion and heartache, a different kind of search was gaining momentum in the digital world. Francesca's story, with its compelling elements, a vibrant young woman, a solo adventure, a stunning final photograph, had captured the imagination of online communities. On motorcycle adventure forums and true crime websites, dedicated threads became sprawling archives of speculation and amateur investigation. Hundreds of anonymous users, armed with little more than an internet connection and a desire to solve a puzzle, dissected every known detail of the case. These online detectives subjected Francesca's last photo to a level of scrutiny the official investigation could never afford. They used astronomical data to calculate the precise time of day based on the length and direction of the shadows. They cross-referenced mountain profiles with geological survey maps, igniting fierce debates over the exact location of the turquoise lake. Theories flourished, branching off in a dozen different directions. Some were plausible. Perhaps Francesca had taken a lesser-known unpaved route not considered by law enforcement. Others veered into pure speculation. She had met with foul play at a remote campsite, been intentionally targeted for her expensive motorcycle, or even orchestrated her own disappearance to start a new life. Mark Sullivan became a nightly visitor to these forums. He would sit in the dark, long after Eleanor had gone to bed, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating his tired face. He read every comment, followed every link, and fell down every rabbit hole. The forums were a double-edged sword. On one hand, they offered a strange sort of comfort. Here was a community of people who refused to let Francesca be forgotten. They kept her story alive, their collective energy a bulwark against the crushing silence. But on the other hand, the wild, often baseless speculation was a form of torture. Reading theories about his daughter's final moments, imagined in lurid detail by strangers, was an agonizing experience. Yet he couldn't look away. Each new post held the slim, desperate possibility of a breakthrough, a forgotten detail, a fresh perspective that everyone else had missed. Years passed. The seasons in the Rockies turned, and with them, the case grew colder. 2 years became 3. Then, In the fall of 2021, the silence was shattered by a sudden, electrifying bolt of hope. A tip came in through the National Missing Persons Hotline. The caller was a tourist, a woman from Ohio who had been on a road trip through the Southwest with her husband. While eating at a small, dusty diner in a remote town in northern Arizona, she claimed to have been served by a waitress who bore an uncanny resemblance to the photos of Francesca Sullivan she had seen online. The waitress was the right age, had the same hair color and build, and, the caller noted, had a profound sadness in her eyes that seemed out of place. The tip was forwarded to Detective Miller's old department and then to the Sullivan family. The news sent a shockwave through their lives. For 3 years, they had been suspended in a state of agonizing ambiguity. Now, suddenly, there was a tangible possibility. They tried to temper their expectations, to remind themselves of the countless false leads and mistaken identities in such cases. But hope is a powerful, irrational force. Eleanor found herself imagining the reunion, the questions she would ask, the story Francesca would tell. Mark allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that his daughter was alive, that she had somehow survived and was waiting to be found. The information was relayed to the local sheriff's office in Arizona. A deputy was dispatched to the diner, a low-slung building on a lonely stretch of highway. He walked in, the bell above the door jingling, and scanned the room. He saw her immediately, a young woman with brown hair tied back, moving between tables with a coffee pot in her hand. He approached her table and quietly asked to speak with her. The woman was startled, then wary. She led him to a small office in the back. The deputy explained the situation gently, showing her the flyer with Francesca's face on it. The woman stared at the photo for a long moment. She acknowledged the resemblance but shook her head. She pulled her driver's license from her wallet and handed it to him. Her name was different. Her date of birth was different. She was a local woman who had lived in the town her whole life, a single mother working 2 jobs to make ends meet. The sadness in her eyes was her own. The phone call to the Sullivan family was brief and clinical. The lead was a dead end. The woman in the diner was not Francesca. The news was devastating. The crash back to reality was brutal and swift. The sudden surge of hope made its loss all the more painful. It was, Eleanor would later say, like losing her daughter all over again. The emotional whiplash left them drained, hollowed out. By 2023, 5 years after Francesca's disappearance, the case was no longer cold. It was cryogenic. Detective Miller had retired, handing his files, including the thick binder with Sullivan on the spine, to a younger detective juggling a heavy caseload of fresh crimes. The flyers the Sullivans had so painstakingly posted were long gone, either bleached featureless by the relentless sun or torn down and replaced by newer, more urgent notices. The online forums had mostly fallen silent. The main thread about Francesca's case was now buried pages deep, only occasionally revived by a newcomer who would ask, "Any updates on this?" The answer was always the same: no. To the world, Francesca Sullivan was a ghost, a fading digital memory. But for her family, she remained a constant, painful presence. They were trapped in the amber of that last week of August 2018. Their grief had transformed from a sharp, acute pain into a chronic, incurable condition. The not knowing was a physical weight, a permanent ache in the center of their lives. The investigation was dormant. The leads were exhausted. The hope that had once sustained them had withered into a fragile, almost translucent thing. For 6 years, the mystery of Francesca Sullivan lay dormant, buried under the weight of time and the vastness of the Colorado wilderness. The answer, when it came, was not unearthed by a detective's dogged work or a long-awaited confession. It was revealed by the raw, indiscriminate power of nature, hundreds of miles south of where anyone had ever thought to look. The late summer of 2024 brought a monsoon season of historic proportions to the American Southwest. A persistent atmospheric river, thick with tropical moisture, stalled over the region, unleashing torrential downpours day after day. In the high desert of northern New Mexico, the parched earth could not absorb the deluge. Dry arroyos became raging torrents, and the Rio Grande, the great river that carves the state in two, began to swell. It transformed from its usual placid, meandering state into a violent, churning artery of mud-brown water. The river rose with terrifying speed, breaching its banks and tearing at the ancient volcanic rock of its gorge. The sound was a constant low roar, the grinding of boulders and the hiss of silt-laden water moving at immense speed. It was a scouring event, a once-in-a-generation flood that reshaped the riverbed, tearing loose logjams that had been in place for decades and depositing tons of new debris along its altered course. A few days after the floodwaters had crested and begun their slow retreat, a local kayaker named Ben Carter decided to survey the changed river. Carter, a river guide in his 40s, knew the Rio Grande Gorge intimately. He was drawn by a mix of professional curiosity and a desire to witness the aftermath of the historic flood. The river was still running high and fast, the water the color of coffee with cream, littered with uprooted trees and unfamiliar obstacles. He navigated the treacherous currents with practiced skill, his small craft dwarfed by the immense, sheer walls of the gorge. About an hour into his journey, in a remote section of the canyon known as the Taos Box, he spotted something that didn't belong. Against the west bank, caught in a newly formed tangle of driftwood and debris, was a flash of unnatural color. It was a patch of faded muddy red wedged between a large cottonwood trunk and the rocky shore. This part of the canyon was pure wilderness, completely inaccessible by any road or trail. From his vantage point in the middle of the river, it was just an odd shape, a piece of modern refuse jarringly out of place in the primeval landscape. Intrigued, Carter angled his kayak toward the bank, fighting the powerful current that tried to pull him downstream. As he got closer, the shape resolved itself. It wasn't a piece of plastic or a discarded barrel. With a jolt of shock, he recognized the distinct curve of a motorcycle's handlebars and the top of a front fairing sticking out of the mud and silt. The rest of the machine was buried, held fast by the immense weight of the waterlogged debris. He could see that the red paint was scraped and dulled, but the object was unmistakably a motorcycle. A cold knot formed in his stomach. No one could have accidentally crashed here. There were no roads for miles, only the sheer cliffs of the gorge rising hundreds of feet on either side. A motorcycle in this specific spot meant only one thing: it had been put there deliberately. Realizing the gravity of his discovery, Carter knew he had to report it. He backed his kayak away from a logjam, marked the location in his mind by triangulating distinctive rock formations on the canyon rim, and began paddling hard. He had to travel another 2 miles downstream, navigating the still turbulent water, before he reached a point where the gorge widened slightly and a weak cell signal could penetrate the canyon walls. He beached his kayak on a sandy spit, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out his phone. He dialed 911. He explained to the dispatcher, his voice steady despite his adrenaline, that he had found a motorcycle in the river in the Taos Box, and gave the most precise location he could. He stressed that it was in a place that could not be reached on foot. The call was routed to the New Mexico State Police. Given the location, the initial responding officers had to drive to the nearest overlook, the Manby Hot Springs trailhead, and use high-powered binoculars to try and spot the location Carter had described. They could just make out the red object in the debris field below. They quickly confirmed his assessment: a ground recovery was impossible. The terrain was too steep, too treacherous, and the river was still too dangerous to attempt a crossing. The decision was made to activate the NMSP's aviation unit. The following morning, the deep thumping sound of rotor blades echoed through the Rio Grande Gorge. A Black Bell 407 helicopter, with state police emblazoned in gold on its side, appeared over the canyon rim. It descended carefully, its pilots expertly navigating the tricky winds that swirled between the gorge walls. On board was a tactical flight officer and a police diver from the New Mexico State Police dive team. The helicopter established a stable hover 50 feet above the churning river, its rotor wash whipping the surface of the water into a frenzy. The diver, clad in a dry suit, was lowered on a steel cable. He plunged into the cold, murky water and fought his way through the current to the logjam. For several minutes, he worked beneath the surface, his movements communicated to the flight officer above via radio. He had to dig through packed silt and maneuver heavy, waterlogged branches to free the motorcycle enough to attach the lifting straps. He secured the cables around the bike's sturdy frame, ensuring the load would be balanced. He gave the signal, slowly. With immense power, the helicopter began to climb. The cables went taut. For a moment, the motorcycle resisted, held by the suction of the deep mud. Then, with a great sucking heave, it broke free. The machine emerged from the river, a monstrous, dripping thing. Mud and brown river sludge streamed from its every crevice. It was the red motorcycle from Francesca's photo, but transformed by its time in the water. It dangled in the air, a wounded artifact suspended between the sky and the river, as the helicopter carefully airlifted it away from the gorge walls. In the background, spanning the immense canyon in the distance, was the elegant arching steel of the Rio Grande Gorge Bridge. The helicopter carried its strange cargo a mile downriver and gently deposited it on a flat, accessible sandbar, where a team of officers and a crime scene unit were waiting. The moment the bike was on the ground, the officers moved in. It was caked in a thick layer of mud and algae. An officer used a bottle of water and a rag to carefully clean the steering head, searching for the one piece of information that mattered most. After a minute of wiping away the grime, he found it. A small metal plate stamped with a series of letters and numbers. He read the vehicle identification number aloud to another officer, who relayed it over the radio to the state police dispatcher. They waited. The only sounds were the gurgle of the river and the crackle of the police radio. A few minutes passed. Then the dispatcher's voice came back clear and laced with surprise. The VIN was a positive match. The 2016 BMW G310R motorcycle was registered to one Francesca Sullivan. The dispatcher continued, her tone now more urgent. The vehicle was flagged, linked to a high-profile missing person case, a case that had gone cold 6 years ago, filed by the Hinsdale County Sheriff's Office in Colorado. A wave of stunned silence passed through the officers on the riverbank. They looked from the mud-caked motorcycle back towards the distant bridge. This wasn't a local case. This wasn't a recently dumped bike. This was a ghost from 6 years ago, a mystery that had just washed up on their shore hundreds of miles from where it began. The cold case of Francesca Sullivan had just roared back to life in the muddy waters of the Rio Grande. The discovery of the motorcycle sent a jolt through 3 separate lives, collapsing 6 years of time into a single shocking moment. In New Mexico, the case was assigned to Detective Mateo Reyes of the State Police's Criminal Investigations Bureau. Reyes was a sharp, patient investigator, a man who had built a career on solving the kinds of complex, layered cases that others found daunting. He understood that cold cases weren't just about old files, they were about dormant grief, and his first actions were guided by that understanding. His new case file began with a single photograph, the mud-caked red BMW dripping on the riverbank. His first call was a professional courtesy, a bridge across time and state lines to the man who had started it all. He tracked down David Miller's number and reached the retired detective at his home in a quiet Colorado suburb. Miller listened in stunned silence as Reyes detailed the discovery in the Rio Grande Gorge. For 6 years, Miller had been haunted by the Sullivan case, by the feeling that he had missed something, that the vastness of the mountains had beaten him. The news that the bike had been found so far away was not just a shock. It was a profound vindication of his nagging instinct that this was never a simple accident. He offered Reyes his complete cooperation, promising to overnight his original unofficial case notes, the ones filled with his own theories and dead-end scribbles. Reyes's second call was infinitely more difficult. He dialed the number for the Sullivan family. Mark Sullivan answered on the second ring. Reyes identified himself and, as gently as he could, explained that Francesca's motorcycle had been recovered. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, thick with the weight of 6 years of unanswered questions. Reyes heard Eleanor's voice in the background, a sharp intake of breath. He explained the circumstances, the flood, the kayaker, the location in New Mexico. The news did not bring the relief of a resolution. Instead, it was a seismic event shattering the fragile peace the Sullivans had built over the years. The ambiguous hope they had clung to, the faint, irrational possibility that Francesca had simply walked away to start a new life, was instantly obliterated. It was replaced by a terrifying new reality, a fresh wave of grief mixed with a dreadful, burgeoning fear. The discovery of the bike meant the story wasn't over. It was entering a new, darker chapter. While the emotional shock waves radiated outward, the physical evidence began its own journey. The red BMW was carefully loaded onto a flatbed truck and transported under police escort to the New Mexico State Police Crime Laboratory in Santa Fe. Here, in a sterile, brightly lit bay, away from the wildness of the river, the motorcycle would be forced to give up its secrets. The first specialist to examine the bike was a forensic metallurgist, an expert in the language of decay. His job was to determine how long the motorcycle had been submerged. He spent hours meticulously examining the machine using magnifying lenses and taking microscopic samples. His report, delivered to Detective Reyes 2 days later, contained the first bombshell. The motorcycle, he concluded with near certainty, had not been in the Rio Grande for 6 years. The rust patterns were too superficial. A vehicle submerged for that long in an active river would show deep, pervasive pitting and corrosion, especially on untreated steel components like the brake discs and chain. This bike showed significant surface rust, but not the deep structural decay he would expect. Furthermore, the aquatic life, the algae and microbial colonies found in the bike's crevices, were consistent with a single season of growth, not multiple cycles of winter freezes and summer blooms. His final assessment was stunning. The motorcycle had been in the water for no more than a year and likely as little as 6 to 8 months. This finding fundamentally altered the timeline. If the bike had only been in the river for a year at most, where had it been for the previous 5? The question hung in the air of the incident room as Reyes and his small team absorbed the information. The second bombshell followed quickly from another lab. A vehicle reconstruction expert had analyzed the motorcycle's physical damage, and his findings were just as game-changing. He reported an almost complete lack of the kind of damage associated with a typical motorcycle accident. There were no long parallel scrapes or road rash on the engine casings, fairings, or handlebars that would indicate the bike had slid on its side along asphalt or gravel. The forks were not bent from a frontal collision, nor was the swing arm twisted from a sideways impact. Instead, the damage was bizarrely symmetrical and vertical. The frame was bent downwards as if it had landed perfectly flat on its wheels from a great height. The suspension was blown out, the wheels were buckled, and the engine block had hairline fractures consistent with a single catastrophic shock wave traveling up through the chassis. The expert concluded his report with a chilling sentence. The damage profile is inconsistent with any form of roadway accident and is highly consistent with a freefall impact from a significant height, landing in a body of water which cushioned the initial impact but did not prevent catastrophic structural failure. Detective Reyes didn't need the report to spell it out. He pulled up a map of the recovery location. The spot where the kayaker found the bike was less than a quarter-mile downstream from the Rio Grande Gorge Bridge. The bridge deck stood 650 feet above the river. The conclusion was inescapable. The motorcycle hadn't been ridden into the river or crashed near its banks. It had been intentionally pushed or dropped from the bridge. In the main briefing room of the NMSP headquarters, Reyes stood before a large whiteboard. With a black marker, he drew a line through the old theory. Accident, Colorado, 2018. It was a ghost story, a fiction they had all believed for 6 years. He began to construct a new timeline, one based on the irrefutable science from the lab. Francesca Sullivan had disappeared in 2018. Her motorcycle, however, had not. It had remained in the possession of an unknown person for at least 5 years. Then, sometime in late 2023 or early 2024, that person had driven it to the middle of the Rio Grande Gorge Bridge, likely in the dead of night, and sent it plummeting into the abyss below. It was a calculated act of disposal. With this new timeline, the entire nature of the investigation shifted. Reyes made a formal request to have the case status officially changed. The paperwork was filed, and the disappearance of Francesca Sullivan was reclassified from a cold missing person case to an active homicide investigation. The jurisdictional lines blurred. This was no longer just Colorado's mystery. It was New Mexico's murder. The motorcycle, now central to a homicide case, was treated with even greater reverence. It was a 6-year-old crime scene. A team of technicians began a complete, painstaking teardown, disassembling the machine piece by piece on a clean plastic sheet, examining every component for any trace of hidden evidence. They knew it was a long shot. The violent impact and months in the river would have destroyed most forensic traces, but they had to try. Days into the teardown, a young technician was working on the intake system. He carefully removed the fuel tank to get access to the airbox, a plastic chamber designed to feed clean air to the engine. It was a sealed, protected environment, one of the few places on the bike that might have remained relatively dry and shielded from the elements. As he unclipped the cover, he saw something inside nestled next to the paper air filter. It wasn't a leaf or a piece of debris that had been sucked in. It was man-made. Using tweezers, he carefully extracted the object. It was a small, brittle piece of paper folded into a tight square. It was faded and water-stained around the edges, but the core of it was surprisingly well preserved. He gently unfolded it. It was a fragment torn from a larger page. The paper was thin, glossy, the kind used in a road atlas. On it were the faint red and blue lines of state highways and county roads, and the unmistakable typography of a printed map. It showed a small, sparsely populated section of a rural county in northern New Mexico, not far from the Colorado border and just a 2-hour drive from the Rio Grande Gorge. One of the small towns marked on the map fragment was circled faintly in blue pen. The discovery sent a fresh charge of electricity through the investigation. This was the clue they were looking for, a tangible link between the motorcycle and a specific place. It was a message from the past, preserved by chance in the dark, dry confines of the airbox. Why would it be there? Perhaps it was Francesca's, a piece of the map she was using to navigate. Or, more chillingly, perhaps it belonged to her killer, a reminder of a location tucked away and forgotten for years. The final horrifying theory began to crystallize on Reyes's whiteboard. Francesca hadn't vanished in the high passes of the San Juans. Her joyful message from the top of the world was not her last stop. She had continued south, crossing the state line into New Mexico, following the route on her map. And somewhere in that remote, sun-beaten county, she had been intercepted. She had been murdered. Her killer, for reasons they could not yet fathom, perhaps keeping the bike as a trophy or simply being unable to get rid of it without attracting attention, had hidden the motorcycle for 5 long years. It was a constant secret liability. Finally deciding to sever the last link to his crime, he had dumped it from the bridge, believing it would be lost forever in the depths of the Rio Grande. The discovery of the map fragment was not a key, but a compass. It pointed the entire weight of the reopened investigation toward a specific, sparsely populated county in the high desert of northern New Mexico. The circled town on the brittle piece of paper became the epicenter of a new, intensive search. Detective Reyes coordinated a multi-agency task force, bringing in sheriff's deputies and seasoned search and rescue volunteers from across the region. For weeks, they combed the unforgiving landscape. This was a world of sagebrush, pinyon, and crumbling mesas, a stark contrast to the alpine forests where the search for Francesca had begun 6 years prior. Teams walked slow, deliberate grid patterns, their eyes scanning the arid ground for any sign out of place, a scrap of faded fabric, a glint of metal, or the subtle disturbance of soil that might indicate a shallow grave. They explored abandoned ranch houses, descended into dry arroyos, and peered into the shadows of box canyons. They interviewed the handful of long-term residents in the small town circled on the map, showing them Francesca's smiling photo. But the faces they met were blank. 6 years was an eternity here. A lone traveler on a motorcycle was a fleeting image, long since erased by thousands of uneventful days. The search, conducted with diligence and hope, yielded nothing. The land, vast and silent, offered no clues. The official search was eventually and reluctantly wound down. Just as the case seemed destined to stall once more, the Rio Grande, the river that had already given up one secret, offered another. Weeks after the official search teams had departed, a geology professor from the University of New Mexico was conducting research along the gorge. Her work focused on the effects of the recent flood. Studying the newly exposed layers of sediment along the riverbanks in an area several miles downstream from where the motorcycle was found, she noticed an object protruding from a freshly cut bank. It was too white, its shape too uniform to be a rock. Using her rock hammer, she gently scraped away the surrounding dirt and, with a jolt, recognized the unmistakable form of a human bone. Detective Reyes returned to the gorge with a team from the office of the medical investigator. They began a careful archaeological excavation, unearthing partial, scattered human remains from the compacted soil. In the sterile environment of the OMI lab, a forensic anthropologist began the painstaking analysis. The initial findings were consistent with Francesca. The remains belonged to a female likely in her late 20s, with a stature estimated between 5 feet 6 inches and 5 feet 8 inches. As the anthropologist meticulously examined each recovered bone, she noted a significant feature on the right clavicle, a distinct raised ridge of bony callus, the unmistakable sign of a fully healed ante-mortem fracture. This unique individualizing characteristic became the investigation's primary focus for identification. Investigators revisited the original missing person file from 6 years prior, which contained Francesca's detailed medical history. Cross-referencing the anthropologist's findings with these records, they found a perfect match, a notation of a severe right clavicle fracture from a bicycling accident when Francesca was 16. The specific location and nature of the healed break on the recovered bone corresponded exactly with her medical records. It was the final tragic piece of corroboration they needed. The official report concluded with a presumptive identification with an extremely high degree of medical certainty. While the bones told the story of who she was, they were silent on how she died. The partial nature of the remains revealed no clear cause of death, no bullet holes, no cut marks, no signs of the violence that had surely occurred. The manner of death was officially ruled a homicide, but the means were undetermined. The news brought a final, terrible confirmation to the Sullivan family. The torment of not knowing where their daughter was had ended, replaced by the stark certainty of her murder. It was a sorrowful, agonizing form of closure. The case of Francesca Sullivan is now officially classified as an unsolved homicide. The identity of her killer and the story of her final days remain lost to the past, a secret held by the vast New Mexico landscape. The investigation remains open, a cold file waiting for a confession or a new clue that may never surface, leaving behind only the permanent, unsolved echo of a life cut short.